All right, well, thanks everybody for joining today. Welcome to How to Preserve and Strengthen Workplace Culture with Remote Teams. My name is Todd Macy. I'm the president of Vital Learning. We're based in Denver, Colorado. And the topic for today is workplace culture in the context of people working remotely or having a new hybrid work environment, which for a lot of work settings is something that's new and people are just getting used to. There's various challenges, especially as we're in month 6 and beyond for a lot of organizations, and these kind of changes that they're experiencing. How do you preserve? How do you strengthen your workplace culture when you no longer have the benefit of being in person, or maybe you're not in person as often, or the workplace setting, kind of the day-to-day is just a little bit different. It's one of the challenges that a lot of folks are dealing with right now, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So a couple logistics before we get things started. There is a chat window. So for a lot of you, if you're on a laptop device anyway, you should be able to hover down and the chat window should pop up. If there are any questions that you have, comments, thoughts, we always love to hear from you and make this as interactive as possible as we're going through this topic today. Certainly feel free to type in there any questions that you have, comments, thoughts. My colleagues, Tom and Marie, will be answering any questions you have. Anything that requires kind of further discussion, happy to have that as well. Another thing worth mentioning, there'll be an ebook that we'll be sending you next week. This will take you through all the core concepts that we're going to cover in these slides, and towards the last half of this webinar, we're going to talk about 7 practical tips and strategies for how to address various challenges and items that relate to preserving and strengthening workplace culture in a remote work environment. So we have an ebook put together that covers all those topics. That's going to be an available resource for you for anyone who's registered for this webinar. It'll also later be available on our website as well. So don't feel that you need to write down every single slide. There will be a nice resource for you that we'll be sending you a little bit later on this week. 2 things I just wanted to mention before we get rolling with this webinar. We have 2 prior webinars, and if this is a topic that is of interest to you, these prior webinars may be relevant as well. So we had a webinar where we talked about the hybrid workplace, the future of work, how work environments are going to change in really this post-COVID era, and what that's going to mean. I think there's a lot of things that as we'll touch on in this webinar, but this prior webinar goes into a lot more depth on this. There's a lot of areas that are going to change in terms of work setting for the long term. So how can we be best prepared? How can we best adjust to those environment changes that a lot of folks are going to experience? Other webinar that we had that might be worth checking out is talking about change. So of course, 2020 has been a period of a lot of change that's been happening. It's been certainly accelerated in a lot of different areas. How can you use all that change and take that as an opportunity to grow? That's what we talk about in that prior webinar. Again, we'll kind of touch on some of those things, but that webinar goes into a lot more depth on that topic. So you can find the recordings of both of those webinars. There's also some ebooks on those 2 topics as well on our website. If you go to vitallearning.com /COVID-resources, you'll be able to view those webinars as well. All right, I want to get started with a scenario. Now, this might be something that resonates with you or feels familiar. So let's say that you are an employee at a mid-sized company. Previously, you did all of your work in person. It was 100% in the office, very traditional kind of office setup and environment. You have a 9-to-5 job. You go into the same physical location every day. And that was your routine. That was what you were used to. That was what you were comfortable with. Now, as the pandemic came into the US in March this year, all of that really got upended. All of a sudden, out of nowhere, you're having to work remotely and you're spending most of your time, most of your workday at home instead of in the office. Now, there's certainly been some things that you've enjoyed about that. You really like not having a commute. There are certain times that you feel more productive. There's maybe some meetings that that used to happen that were no longer happening. That's great. You enjoy that added flexibility. You can work out during the workday. So there's certainly some benefits that you have. However, there's certain elements of your job that you feel is kind of missing. The organization you're at has an excellent culture, and one that you're really proud to be a part of and love to be a part of, and you kind of feel that slipping away a little bit because there's not that in-person interaction with various colleagues that for the most part you really enjoy being around. You feel that some of the benefits and some of the things that you really loved about going into work when it was in person, those are fading away a little bit, and that's a concern for you. You feel that communication isn't quite the same today where it used to be. There's certain things that you're kind of confused on, you're not sure about. Communication, which previously was working pretty well, has not been as effective during this period of remote work. You also feel that you're just a little out of the loop. You feel isolated. You feel a little lonely working from home. So this is a scenario that is quite common. There's a lot of people that have been experiencing something like this over the last 6 months. Maybe some or all of those items resonate with you personally. So the question I ask and what we're going to cover today is, how do you handle that? What do you do? What are steps you can take and actions you can take to help address some of those challenges that identified? As a manager of those employees, what can you do? If you're leading a group that's having those types of challenges, what are the steps that you can take? And further, as a human resources or a learning and development professional, what can you do? What guidance can you provide to your leadership? What actions and steps can you take personally to help the people on their team be in a better position when they're working remotely? So that's what we're going to talk about today as we cover preserving and strengthening workplace culture in remote work environments. Quick overview of what we're going to cover. Just going to give some brief background and context on COVID-19 and remote work. There are a couple interesting stats that just wanted to share and chat a bit briefly. We'll talk about workplace culture, what it is. We're going to define that a little bit further. It can be kind of an amorphous term, so we're going to give that hopefully a little bit more clarity. We're going to talk about the challenges of remote work. What are the various benefits? What are the drawbacks that we tend to see with remote work? And really what we're going to build towards that kind of background and context, we're going to get into 7 steps and actions that you can take. And really, I always like to have folks attending these kind of things walk away with tangible resources and steps and ideas on what specifically they can do to address these challenges. So there's going to be 7 kind of topics that we're going to talk about. And within each of those topics, we'll chat a little bit further about what that challenge involves. And we're going to talk about what are things specifically that you can do to address that challenge. All right, some interesting background and stats as it relates to COVID-19 and remote work. Of course, as all of you know, there's been a lot more remote work that's been happening, but let's look at kind of the figures behind this. Prior to COVID, about 25% of workers did any remote work at all. So only about 1/4 of the US population had experienced any form of remote work prior to this. Now, seemingly overnight, now a majority of the US workforce is doing entirely remote or partially remote, what we call that the hybrid work setting. So now a majority of US workers are working remotely. Now, not every job can be remote, but for the most part, almost every job that it's possible by the job function to be working remotely, people are either doing 100% or partial remote and have been that way for the last 6 months. I think, more interesting to me than just this, kind of temporary shift, because I think a lot of the mentality, especially at the beginning, was, all right, we're going to work remotely for a couple months, and then we're going to get back to it. Things are going to, we're going to get back into the office. It'll sort of all return to where it was previously. I think, as months go on, it's becoming more and more clear that that's not the case. And what I think is particularly interesting is what this pandemic is going to do for the future of our work environments, and what are going to be the long-term shifts and changes. And I think there's some really powerful early indicators that this is going to be a long-term shift. There's going to be various kind of long-term changes that are happening. 74% of companies recently surveyed said they plan to permanently shift to doing more remote work. And part of that is because of the feedback and how things have been going with remote work. Of course, there's been various challenges, but various folks have been expressing, we really like the flexibility. It's something that, especially among young workers, is one of the most important things that they look for in a job, is flexibility. That's able to happen a lot more easily, of course, with working remotely. 81% of people say, if given the choice, they would prefer to work remotely. So something that, was, even prior to all of this, something that folks asked for is now a reality. And this experiment is happening, and, we're seeing generally favorable results. Of course, there are a lot of challenges and downsides to all this as well, and we're going to chat about that too. Employees tend to be more productive on the whole working remotely. Now, this is a stat that's a little bit of a mixed bag. It's not a clear item like, I would say, flexibility, right? If you're working remotely, almost certainly you're going to have more flexibility. If you're working remotely, some teams have seen more productivity. Other teams have been, kind of neutral on that, and other teams have seen decreased productivity. So it really matters how the team is structured. We dive into that in the Change webinar in more details, if that's a topic that you're interested in. Finally, organizations have been seeing the cost savings of remote work, whether that's with office space or other overhead expenses. Remote work saves organizations money. So there is this kind of pervasive underlying drive, and I think it's one of the reasons why this hybrid work setting, so doing some remote work and some type of in-person work, whether that's the same as it was previously or something that looks a little bit different, that's going to be more and more pervasive, and I think more and more common as we move towards the future. People are asking for it. They, on the whole, are enjoying it, and companies are seeing various cost savings. So there's a lot of kind of driving factors why this isn't just some kind of temporary shift. I think as managers, as human resources leaders, as learning and development leaders, this is something that we need to adapt to. And that I think is really the critical point here. All right, so before I move on, just want to give a quick poll and just get a pulse on this group in terms of this audience that we have today. What percentage of you all have been working remotely over the last 6 months or so? So I'm going to launch this poll. Give you just one question. Are you working remotely? Yes, fully remotely. Yes, partially remotely. Have not been working remotely, or not applicable. So give you 5 seconds or so. Should hopefully be a pretty easy one to answer. And then we will close this poll. All right. Thanks everybody for participating in that. I think colleague Tom should hopefully be able to share the answers of that poll. I'm not able to see that on my end, but My guess is that majority of folks have been working fully or partially remotely. Okay, let's move on. Talk about the benefits and the downsides of remote work. Now, touched on these previously, so I'm just going to go through these quickly. Flexibility, job satisfaction. On the whole, now this isn't necessarily applicable to each individual, right? Job satisfaction on the individual level might be going down for remote work, but there's been data over the years, so prior to the pandemic, as well as data gathered during the pandemic that's showing that job satisfaction is improving on the whole with remote work and that flexibility that it brings. Productivity, again, depending on the team, this could kind of swing either way. But on the whole, a slight majority of teams are more productive during remote work versus less productive. From a human resources and recruiting perspective, it opens up the talent pool. So it can enable a team potentially to hire someone who's not necessarily in the same geographic location, which can be great, right? We're gonna have a future webinar on hiring and retention, so look out for that in the coming months, kind of in this current setting. So we're gonna dive into that topic in a little bit more detail in the future. Lower turnover really because of the various factors above. So as you all know, job satisfaction, as well as other things like the quality of your manager, the leadership of the company, the culture of the company, your engagement. Those are all factors that are going to affect turnover. So when those kind of items are going up and employees are happier, of course, there's going to be a little bit less turnover. And also, as I mentioned before, the various kind of cost savings involved with being able to have that flexibility in the remote work, and you can save on some of those overhead and other related items there. Drawbacks on remote work. So there's the productivity. Teams who are not structured in the way to be productive working remotely, and a lot of the times, and talked about this in the prior webinar, is remote work can uncover various issues that were happening. In other words, as managers within the organization might have been really relying on FaceTime and people being in their seats from 9 to 5 as a proxy for productivity and that they're working, which is obviously a bad thing to be leaning on. And now as a manager, if you're working remotely, you don't have that same kind of proxy, which is a proxy, by the way, that should not be in place to begin with. You should be looking at results, weekly metrics, other items that way better map to, are things getting done, is the team being productive versus is someone physically present, right? But teams who might not be set up in the right kinds of way, managed in the right kinds of way, some of that can get uncovered during remote work. Collaboration, that's a common challenge that folks face. Communication, we'll dive into that a bit further. It's a new medium, so that it can certainly be a challenge communicating when you don't have the benefit of being in person. IT challenges, I think that was something that was really spiked at the beginning, right? And kind of March, April timeframe as offices were moving into people's guest beds, right? And the various kind of IT connectivity issues that were involved. So those were certainly something that was a lot higher a little bit earlier on, kind of early in the pandemic, but is definitely something that still continues to happen. Having that connection, it can be a little harder, and you might need to be more intentional about it to maintain connection with your coworkers if, again, you don't have the benefit of being in the same physical space. And really all that kind of blends into this last one, culture. And so I think you can kind of break these down into the 4 C's right here. And today we're going to focus on the culture C, but I think it's important to note that collaboration, communication, connection, those are all elements that impact culture. So these are all related. They all kind of blend together, I think, in a lot of ways. All right, another poll from you. So we're gonna launch this poll, and two questions I would love to hear from you about. One is, if you've been working remotely, you get this launched right now. Okay, so two questions. One is, if you've been working remotely, what's been your biggest challenge of remote work? And there are six answers there in that poll. So just choose the closest one that's in the poll to the biggest challenge that you've been facing. Maybe that'll kind of spark some ideas there in terms of what challenges have you been facing. And then I also would love to hear what's been your favorite thing about working remotely or working in kind of a partial remote hybrid work setting. And also choose the closest one there. However, would also love to hear in the chat. So if there are other kind of something you want to elaborate, or maybe really the top challenge you've been facing isn't really reflected in those poll questions, please enter that into the chat as well. Just love to hear and get some insight into with this group here today. What have been the biggest challenges that you all have been facing, and what are some things that you like about working remotely? So give 15, 20 seconds or so for you to start to type that in. All right, so thanks everybody who answered the poll today. And we're going to move on and talk a little bit about culture. So I think it's just helpful to give a little bit more clarity and definition around culture. The term culture is used a whole lot. You hear that term mentioned a whole ton, especially as it relates to human resources and the health of an organization and that kind of thing. But I think it's a term that is often not really clearly understood or defined. And in fact, in a recent poll, only about 12% of companies said that they really felt like they understood what culture is and what it means. So I want to help to kind of clarify that, hopefully, and give a little bit further definition to culture. I think if you talk about it, really loosely, and if you're to maybe just ask someone on the street, what would you say is organizational culture? An answer you might hear is, well, it's kind of the overall vibe of the organization, and I think that does I think in part capture it, right? But what does that really mean? I think one way you can look at culture and to kind of define it more specifically. Now, of course, there's more than one way to kind of look at this, but I think that this is a way that to me brings a lot of clarity to this term. Culture is the environment that you set for your employees. So really defining it as the environment that's created for your employees and for the team. And really what goes into culture, it's a mix of various factors. So it's something that is created out of all of these factors kind of coming into it. It is something that really takes a life of its own out of these various factors. And some of those being the leadership of the organization, the actual values that are emphasized and taken action on. So maybe maybe not necessarily the values that are written in the corporate statement. What creates the culture are the values that are actually taken action upon. The beliefs of the organization, the interactions that people have within the organization, the behaviors that are exhibited and encouraged and reinforced, and the characteristics, really the makeup of the individuals on the team. What are their values? What are the things that are important to them? How do they behave? How do they interact with others? All of these factors kind of come in to create this kind of amorphous thing that is culture. And I think the really fascinating thing about culture is, it truly does take on a life of its own. And it begins to evolve and shift depending on all of the kind of ingredients and variables that are coming into it. So it is something that has a life of its own. It obviously changes and is influenced by all of these ingredients that that might be changed or shifted over time as the organization evolves. It's something that is shared organization-wide. It's something that's pervasive, and it's something that is enduring, right? No single individual creates the culture. It is something that is done by a mix of everybody on the team, by all of these kind of factors combined. So in that way, it is this kind of melting pot, right, of all of these elements that are combined to make this culture. I think something else that's interesting to note is that a lot of times culture is talked about in terms of something that is organization-wide, right? There is company X's culture, and of course there is the organization-wide culture, but especially at larger organizations or even mid-sized organizations, there are microcultures, right? So the culture and dynamics of a department or a certain team or a group of individuals can be, in some cases, very different than the organization as a whole, right? So the culture of the marketing team might be a lot different than the human resources team or the legal department. Or the sales team, right? And that is all dependent on the leadership and the individuals and the behaviors, kind of all those ingredients that are within that particular team. So I think it's important to be thinking about culture as it relates organization-wide, and also culture as it relates to a specific team, right? And how can you strengthen, how can you preserve kind of culture at a macro level and at a micro level as well? Because culture is this kind of amorphous thing, right? It's not something that can have a singular measure to it. You can't just measure culture like you can revenue, right? Or cost. And so that makes the kind of link between culture and its importance a little bit less clear, right? It's a little bit murkier. But I think, despite that murkiness, that does not mean at all that culture is not important. I think, in fact, the opposite. The culture of the organization, especially because it's something that is so pervasive, it affects the experience of the employee day to day in a big way. And so culture has very direct impacts on what is the employee experience? What is their level of engagement? How satisfied are they? Are they going to stay at this organization? Are they going to be productive? Are they going to grow and develop within this organization? And are they going to perform? So there have been, while culture is, there's no singular measure, there has been, over especially the last couple decades, there's been a lot of research that has been done that has shown companies with strong cultures, and that's usually defined and quantified by employee responses, right? So employees who feel that their company has a really strong culture that they like. Those companies really across the board, now there's always going to be individual exceptions, right? But we're talking on the whole, companies with strong cultures very, very much outperform companies with weak cultures, or companies with the kind of toxic culture that you hear about, right? So it does actually ultimately impact financial performance, and so is something, and probably don't have to convince you all, but it certainly is something that is worth really being mindful of and paying attention to. And so that's just kind of all set up. Let's talk about some ways that in a remote setting that we can strengthen, we can maintain and preserve company culture despite these challenges and despite these kind of different settings. So what are some common challenges with remote work? Just going to highlight these before we jump into the 7 steps right here. So lack of connection, isolation, not feeling like you're being able to live the company's values or experience the things that you really enjoyed about being in person with your colleagues. Building relationships becomes a lot more difficult potentially when you're working remotely. Communication and alignment. The communication channels have changed, and so that can certainly be a challenge when you're working remotely. And keeping folks engaged and accountable and productive. Those are some common challenges. These kind of items I think summarize the most common issues or challenges that are voiced by people who are working remotely. And this is all amplified, I think, today because there are a whole, huge group of individuals who are working remotely for the first time, and they just were by necessity. They were sort of forced into it, right? They didn't necessarily sign up for it, and I think that makes the challenges can potentially amplify them even further, right? So let's talk about these 7 steps that you can take, and we're going to go into each one in more detail. I'm going to kind of walk through some steps you can take, some actions that you can take either as a leader, as an HR L&D professional, or even as an individual employee. Things that you can do specifically to address these common challenges that are associated with culture and working remotely. One is clearly defining your values. So getting that clarity around what is it that makes up the organization? What's the organization's DNA? Being more intentional with your interactions. Setting the tone as a leader. So that's something that, if you're in that leadership position, is really important. Creating a communication plan and clarity around how to best communicate in that remote setting. Practicing relationship building. So again, being intentional about building relationships, which I think is all the more important when you don't have the benefit of those kind of frequent face-to-face interactions. Encouraging collaboration. So what are the steps that you can take to ensure that collaboration is happening more frequently? And finding your ideal mix. So these are really 7 categories of steps and actions that you can take to address those common challenges with remote or hybrid work that I mentioned. I'm going to go through each one. All right, so clearly defining your values. Now, the values of the organization, a lot of organizations have them, right? They exist somewhere. What commonly also does happen, though, is that they're not really used, or that they don't truly capture what is unique and special about the organization. I think if you were to look at the kind of company values that might be put on a website, there are a lot of companies that kind of fall into the trap. And I think it's understandable, right, as these things are getting created, of having very, very generic values. And I think the best test to tell if a company has generic values is, could you apply this to really almost any company and it would fit? In other words, it doesn't talk about what's making your company and your people and your culture unique. These are just, general things that are nice to have in a workplace, right? So I think in looking at the values, think about your company specifically. What makes this organization, what makes this group of individuals unique, and what truly defines the DNA? So, DNA obviously is something that only one person possesses, right? It is very unique to that person. So I think that is an applicable term here in thinking about the values. What are the specific kind of characteristics and elements that make up this particular organization? When you have that clarity, and we'll talk about some steps, some ideas, some things that you can do to get there. When you have that clarity, that can really that can be extremely helpful. It can help you with a lot of things. It can be your kind of guiding light and something that can give you additional clarity around, who do you hire? Who is not a good fit for the organization? Who does not kind of fit in our values? Taking various actions, I think, especially when it comes to difficult decisions or really important priorities, or things that we want to be sure that we're exhibiting as an organization. Having a really good set of values that you have, and whether these are values that are used organization-wide or you kind of are creating your own for your team, I think either way can be highly effective. Using those values to help guide you during those difficult decisions. It can be an absolutely incredible tool, and one that is not very frequently leveraged. So that's why I have this really as a great place to start, and something that highly recommend doing. So what are some things that you can do to help more clearly define your values? Here's some general tips. I think a great place to start here is to look inward at the organization and look at the folks on your team and think about what are their characteristics and attributes. What are the things that really make them awesome and unique? It's a lot easier to do this looking at other folks versus looking at yourself. A lot of times it can be a hard exercise if you're thinking about it for yourself. A lot of times it's easier to look at, all right, who are the couple absolute rock stars in this organization or on my team? Let's look at them. What kind of are their key characteristics and attributes? What are the things that make them special? So that can be a really great place to start, and getting specific. Just to give you some examples of Vital Learning's own values, and I think what makes our team really unique and special. So just to give you a couple of them as an example, one is hungry and tenacious. We really have that kind of gritty, small company startup determination, right? Even though we've been in business for 31 years, we truly have that grit and that tenacity of a startup. Creative and resourceful, able to do a lot with very little. So even with little resources, we're able to get a lot done. So those are just some examples of ones we have. Think about you and your team. Now, with this kind of reflection and thinking about this, can use that kind of thought process to either create these sets of values from scratch if you didn't have any before, or kind of update them or modify them, or maybe you want to create ones. Your company has values that are out there, but you want to create some for your specific department or team, which I think can be a really great exercise and give you this guidance. So from there, With those values, now a lot of values just kind of sit on the shelf, right? Let's talk about how you can actually put those to use. So I think a really good next step here is to define what it looks like and to provide specific examples when someone lives those values. So going back to some of Vital Learning's values, hungry and tenacious. What does it mean when someone exhibits being hungry and tenacious? What does it mean when someone exhibits being creative and resourceful? Think about specific examples. I think the more kind of tangible and tied to reality you can make it, the more likely they're going to A, stick with you, and B, more likely get used. Lastly, think about how you can routinely reinforce these key values, and whether that's a shout out for someone who really exhibited being creative and resourceful. Give them a shout out. Give people feedback who maybe either are or are not exhibiting these values. Work in various activities that reinforce and continue to build upon what are the things that already makes this company and this team really special. So thinking about those to help more clearly define and work in the values of the company. And I think these steps themselves, these are going to be involved in the other 6 things that we mentioned. So if you're doing these types of things, this is also going to help you I think this is a great place to start, because this is also going to help you with the other 6 items that we're going to talk about. Second one here is be intentional with your interactions. I think especially with remote work, it can be easy to kind of get caught in the routine of working. Really just having your heads down, you're focused on your specific tasks, and I think that's a natural outcome of just being at your house, right, or wherever you're working remotely, and not having that team around you. You're more likely to just have your head down and working. And of course, there's obvious upsides to that, right? I mean, we're seeing some more efficiency because unnecessary meetings aren't happening, that kind of thing. But the flip side of that, there can also be some elements of interaction and relationship building that would have happened naturally if you're in person, but just there's not a good opportunity for that, right? So let's talk about some things that you can do to be more intentional. I think a great place to start is think about what is lacking with our team or with the organization since we've been in this new remote setting. What do I feel is missing? You could also just kind of open up that discussion to other folks on your team. What do we really feel like is missing? Where are we lacking? Where are the gaps? After that, can determine some tangible ways to help fill those gaps. So think about where that gap lies, and then start to think about, okay, well, what are we going to do about that? How are we going to address that gap? Take actions that fit your leadership style, fit the culture of the organization and your values. And I think the biggest thing here is just be more intentional about your interactions. So of course, what does come pretty naturally, at least with a lot of teams, is they're intentional about results. At least well-run teams, right? Be intentional in that same kind of way about interactions and relationship building, and think about some ways that you can start to work that into your remote work. Not something that's going to be highly disruptive or seen as a burden, but what are some ways that you can kind of create that intentionality of building your culture and building your values? As a leader within the organization, so if you are in this role, or just anybody who is in this role, they play a really important part of setting the tone. And so as teams and as companies shift to remote work, how the leader of the organization and of the team, how they start to interact in this new remote setting, whether it's consciously or subconsciously. A lot of times, it's not really, people don't even kind of realize that it's happening, but I think it subconsciously has a big impact on what other people are doing and how, they're having their interactions. So how a leader of a team is handling this really affects what other people on the team are doing, right? So a leader can, intentionally or unintentionally, a lot of times it's happening unintentionally, kind of set the rules of the game for how do we interact with each other, what are kind of our standards that we're going to go about as it relates to communication, as it relates to kind of talking with another, as it relates to treating one another, all these kind of things as we move into remote work. So on the flip side of that, there's a really great opportunity too for the leader to set a great example and to set a great tone. So what can you do in this leadership position? And I think these are also good things, even if you're not in that leadership position, to be keeping in mind. So go back to those company values. Think about what they look like in actions, whether it's ones that are existing, ones that you created. Go back to that kind of exercise of thinking about what do our values look like, and then compare that and give an honest assessment to where things are, where the team is in currently living those values, and of yourself, of your team. Are you truly living those core values in that important culture day to day? Then from there, I think you can take, with that honest assessment, think about what are the specific actions you are going to take, or I think in some instances are going to not do, that is going to set the right tone and provide a good example for your team, and set that tone of exhibiting those types of values. And of course, as you're kind of thinking about this and putting together the list, I think it's always good, and I know it can feel a little unnatural, right, to be setting kind of goals and to-dos around this kind of stuff. But I think with remote work, it's a little bit of an unnatural setting, and I think it's something that is a necessary exercise in a lot of instances to start to do. And as you start to do it, it will become more and more natural, worked into your routine, and you might not even need to have kind of to-dos or specific actions that you're planning on taking set. But I think to start with, I think that's a really great way to ensure that intentionality, ensure these kind of actions are worked in regularly. Fourth element here, creating a communication plan. So let's talk about that a little bit more. With working remotely or being in a hybrid work setting, communication is a frequent challenge that people run into. And I think the really kind of big driver behind that is in remote work, the channel has changed. So the communication channels that might have been working great before when you're in person, when you're working remotely, those channels change. And so you need to be mindful of that and adapting to that. The communication plan that's going to work, whether it's a communication plan that's spoken or just sort of understood, right, which is more commonly the case by folks when you're working in person. I think it's definitely wise to be more mindful of and setting a specific plan for remote work, because there's a lot of times not clarity around how we communicate. And without that plan, a lot of times what happens, there's not much communication, or not good communication, not kind of the right communication. And that makes a lot more likely for employees and people on the team to feel kind of out of the loop or confused or isolated. And so with that communication plan in place, and something that you're looking at, getting feedback on and evolving, that's going to help to address some of those key challenges. So what do you do here to put together a communication plan? A couple tips. First, I would take an inventory of what you have communication tools wise currently, right? So look at what are the tools that our team has available to us. What are the tools that we're using? What are just what's out there that we may or may not be using? So whether that's video conference tools, whether that is productivity type or project management type of tools like an Asana, whether that is a kind of email alternative kind of chat channel tool like Slack. So look at what are the tools that the team has available to them right now. So take that inventory. I think that's a good place to start. Then start to gather team feedback and observe how are people communicating currently. Ask people, get feedback. What would be kind of your preferred way to communicate for these kind of various things, right? And frequently, there's going to be different communication forms depending on the channel. So certain things might make most sense to have a video conference meeting on. Other things, the default communication channel is maybe Slack, right? Or email, or working on a project within Asana, whatever that might be. So start to gather that feedback, get a sense of what's going to be the best communication plan for your team. Next step there, with that kind of background info, put together that draft plan and then present that. Get feedback on that, and I think most importantly, put that in place and then evolve that sort of as needed, right? As either things change or people, kind of express various preferences. Some things are working, some things are not working. Lay out that communication plan. Try to make it as simple as possible. Saying, okay, we're gonna cover, XYZ things in a weekly video conference team meeting. We are going to, cover these items over our Slack channel. For these types of emergencies, we're going to cover that by text or a phone call, right? So lay out that plan, put it in place, and start to get feedback on it. Next item here, relationship building. So again, this really goes to being intentional about building relationships and what you can do there. I think humans are really wired for in-person interaction. So I think that's one thing just to note. Another thing to note is that our species is very, very highly adaptable, right? So we can adapt and change to different environments relatively quickly. So even though we might be really wired and kind of default to face-to-face in-person interaction, we're able to adapt to different methods relatively quickly, right? I mean, it depends on the individual. Some faster than others. Something that is a particular challenge, and we're going to talk about in a future webinar coming up in a couple months, is employees being onboarded while everybody's working remotely. I think that presents a unique challenge for building relationships. So steps to practicing relationship building. Think about how remote work has affected your current professional relationships. And it might not necessarily be for the negative, right? I think there were various kind of opportunities that presented themselves during this pandemic for people to get more connected and maybe hop on a Zoom call with relatives or people on the team that they tend to not talk with very often or didn't previously. I think there's been various opportunities to actually grow relationships during this, as various folks talked about, as things kind of slowed down a bit, that opened some things up. So it might not necessarily be for the negative, right? I don't want to make that assumption, but I think starting off and thinking about how remote work has kind of affected things in terms of relationships with folks on the team. Next, start to think about what are some ways that, that will work with our team specifically, ways that we can help to enhance personal connection and bring that more into work. And really that depends on the team. So what's going to work for one team is not going to work for another team. But I think, starting to think about that and, experimenting recently, with various things, right? And getting feedback. So what's pictured here is a virtual wine tour, right? So like a vineyard tour that's virtual, and everybody was shipped a bottle of wine, and they're enjoying that together as a team, as a team building exercise. That might be a totally awesome thing to do for a particular team. Another team that there might be a majority of folks that absolutely hate it, right? So it really just depends on what is that kind of particular team that you're working with. But try some things, whether it's something like that. I think it can be honestly as simple as working into various meetings that you already have scheduled, just talking, taking 10, 15 minutes to provide personal updates. That's something that Vital Learning does every Friday morning with our team meetings, and very kind of minimal time effort, but it's awesome. It's great just to hear kind of what people are up to, and of course those conversations might be happening otherwise, right? But to specifically set aside time for that, I think that's kind of the key component to ensure that those types of conversations are happening. Sixth item here, so second to last thing we're going to go over, encouraging collaboration. What can you do to encourage collaboration within an organization? Collaboration that might just be happening naturally, right? With an open office layout, right? And just various types of people kind of fortuitously running into one another and talking about some item, or working with a different team, or overhearing some conversation. Kind of the benefits of a physical environment might not necessarily be there anymore, right? And so what can you do to be more intentional about creating that collaboration? Think about where can your team benefit from more collaboration. Get some feedback. Start to think about these things, and agree on as a team. Here are a couple things we're going to try. So a few ideas just to throw out there. Creating random Zoom rooms, breaking people up into random breakout rooms, and have them talk about a specific topic. At a nonprofit that I volunteer for, that's been something that they've been doing, and it has worked awesomely. It's been great. So that's one idea. Think about maybe mixing teams up, giving people different assignments. Asking people about what are their development goals, and ensuring that we're gonna try to put you on some special project, right? To have that nice diversity of perspective, and that collaboration, and all sorts of great things can happen from that. Google is a great example, right? They're very intentional about creating that collaboration to help generate ideas. Last item here, find your ideal mix. Right, so I think this hybrid work setting, this working remotely, is something that is likely going to be happening or having effects on in the long term, right? This isn't just a short-term thing. It's been something that's been stressful. There's been challenges. There's been a lot of difficulties, right? That in all in our kind of different ways we've been having to deal with and having to handle. And so thinking about what's going to be best for you and your team. What are kind of the specific actions and things that you can do? How can you be more intentional about culture when you're remote? And it's something that you really have to be more intentional about, something that might have just kind of come naturally, and you might not have had to kind of think about, all right, these are the specific things I'm going to do to help strengthen our culture. As you're moving remote, you might have to be way more intentional about that. And I certainly encourage you to, and kind of find that mix that is going to be a good mix between being productive, getting a lot of work done, being on the same page communication wise, and also maintaining those work relationships, maintaining that strength of the team, really living your values even if people are not in the same room as one another. So just want to leave you with those thoughts. And I think, if anything you take away from this, it's just being more intentional, right? Start to think about it. Some of those steps that I took you through, maybe that can be a good starting place for you.